morning our reading is from the 9th chapter of Mark. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. And there he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He really didn't know what to say because they were frightened. A cloud appeared and enveloped them all. And a voice said, "This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him." And when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The word from the Lord in the house of the Lord. Dealing with a lot of supernatural stuff with our readings today. But according to the Bible, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus went to heaven directly. Nothing in between. I don't know how to explain it. I just read it. You can believe it, you cannot believe it. But understand truly that the transfiguration that we're talking about with Jesus and his disciples is not a supernatural event. It's an awakening. It's a mindset that comes. They were given the power at that moment to truly, just for brief time, to understand what the message was that Christ was bringing to them. Just briefly. They could understand what it was that Christ was talking about, his whole ministry, of the resurrection, of the recognition of the need to be one with him if they were going to be saved. And they didn't understand the message. Every time we read something in the gospel, it's about them challenging him over who gets to sit where, or tell me who's number 1. Well, if you go to a football game, they have big foam fingers that tell you everybody's number 1. So that's not the kind of recognition that we really want to talk about. What they were finding out was that Christ was truly special, truly different, truly rare. Truly one of a kind. They hadn't understood that before. And the fact that Jesus said, coming down the mountain, "Don't tell anybody," simply meant that there was no way they could explain their experience. John Wesley, who's credited with being the founder or the father of Methodism, was an Episcopal priest, a Church of England priest. That's all he wanted to be. When he was a child, he was one of 12. His father was a Church of England priest too, so you can draw whatever conclusion you want from that. But John Wesley was on the 3rd floor of the house when it caught fire. And the neighbors came and made a human pyramid to get him down from the 3rd floor because there was no ladder and the house was burning. And at that point, John's mother decided that John was special to God. And she began to teach him all sorts of things. And his mother was a really, really unusual woman in her times, because she taught Greek and Latin to the women of the neighborhood. Now, at that time, women didn't do things like that. First of all, they weren't supposed to even know Greek and Latin because that was beyond their ability to understand. That's what they said, not what I said. Don't you pin that word on me. But she was a remarkable woman, and from that point on, she drove John to be the priest that he could be. And John went off to college, went off to seminary. He organized a group. They got together every morning for prayer and study, and then they went to visit people in the poorer sections of town. They did it every morning, methodically. And that's why the other students talked about Wesley and his Methodists. So that's how we got our name. But the important thing isn't about how we got our name, but that John Wesley was just a priest. He served a parish. And he felt like he was in a dead-end job. Until one night late at night, he was coming home from a meeting, and he said he felt strangely warmed and overwhelmed with the feeling that God loved him. And that's the point where his whole ministry changed, where his emphasis was no longer on doing the task of being a priest, but rather in touching people's lives. And it was in his social ministry that we get our basis. Well, he said you can't feed the soul of a hungry man. First we need to tend to some needs. First we need to help people to have something to eat, to have some kind of physical hope before we can give them spiritual hope. So that for him, that was the transfiguration of the Christ that he knew. And each of us may or may not have had that experience of suddenly or even gradually feeling an overwhelming sense of what Christ is in our lives. It's great when it happens, but if you've been doing things and if you feel good and if Christ is important to you, you probably had it and it just didn't strike you at the moment. You don't have to be strangely warm. You don't have to be like Saul, knocked down, struck blind to get the message that Christ loves you. It comes about in, hey, last night we had music, we had dancing, we had obvious generosity. There's a warming of your heart. Unless you watch me dance, and then that was just pure comedy. You understand that what Paul wrote about to the church at Corinth is that for those who don't believe at all, they'll never see the truth as Christ has given to us. If you don't believe at all, you can't hear his words. That's what happened to Peter and James and John when they were on the mountain, was that this time, for this moment, when they saw Jesus, Moses, and Elijah together, for that moment, they finally began to understand the truth of the words of Christ. And why would he tell them, don't tell anybody what you saw? Was because no one else was in a position to understand what they had seen. We can walk down the street and we can talk about the miracles of Christ to people and they won't understand unless they have some modicum, some measure of belief that lets their minds grasp what we're talking about. But that doesn't separate us from Christ. And it doesn't separate us from our need to express his love to those around us. To demonstrate his love for those around us. To do little things that make life better for someone else. No, we don't have to build houses for Habitat. We don't have to do a lot of things. But we have to do something. And all we have to do is make the ability for someone to feel human possible. And I don't know what it is. It may be the loaf of bread or the second loaf of bread in the food pantry. It may be the unauthorized visit to the food pantry because we are very hard and fast that we only let them come twice a month unless they need to come more often. We have what we call the TFAPs, the Temporary Emergency Family Assistance Program boxes. And those are once a month. And they're inadequate for anything. But they are state regulated. We're not state regulated. We don't limit Christ's love to those around. We don't limit His blessings to those just so many times a month or so many times a year or so many times in life. What we have to remember is that every day that He touches our life, we owe it to Him to touch someone else's life. Because we aren't recipients, we're conduits. We don't accumulate Christ's love. We pass it on. We sang a song about that, didn't we? It only takes a spark to get a fire going. Yeah, pass it on.
Oh, yeah.
We could sing that one of these days. This is probably not a good configuration, because Ken and I are going to have a lot of conversations that are going to leave you out. So. But it is nice. So when we differ on how many verses and so forth, and we get along fine. Besides that, he missed you when he had to sit with his back to you. That's why he's this way. Where was I? Oh yeah. We're not freezers full of love, because that's frozen love. We don't want to be frozen where we are. We don't want to be hard pressed to give it away. We want to know that we are what Christ wants us to be, conduits of His love to those around us, to accept what we have. And we're blessed. Every one of us is in out of the wind. Every one of us is clothed. Every one of us is in a place we want to be. Well, maybe some husbands aren't, but that's okay. There's no football on. You don't have to go anywhere else. But we get so wrapped up in stuff that we forget that we have a job to do. Retired or not, employed or not, we have a task to be the pipeline for the love of Christ to get to the people who are desperate for it. We're blessed with it. We abound in it. We teem in it. We are buried in it. And if we're not careful, we will be buried without it. Because if we try to hang on to His love, we lose it. The voice came through the cloud and said, "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to Him." And that's the message we have every day of our life. He is the Son of God. Listen to Him. Do what He asks you to do, what He calls you to do. Do the things that take a little more effort than you might have thought about otherwise. Don't have to sell your house and give the money away. You have to find a way to give shelter to someone's heart, so that we can be the conduit. We can be the pipeline. We can be the source of the beauty and the grace of love and the love of Christ to someone who feels so shut out and so separated that they give up hope. He is hope. He is love. And we would like to keep Him all to ourselves. But in trying to do that, we lose Him all by ourselves. He said, "I'll never leave you alone." But if you turn your back on Him, you're pretty close to alone. So, no, I don't expect to see a shimmering vision ever. But if you take a look, we have a sculpture, a small sculpture that was donated to this church anonymously. It's called the Homeless Jesus. It's on the little table by the door to the chapel. If you get a chance, take a look. It reminds us that every face we see, every voice we hear, every person in need is the Christ who needs us to love in his name. And without doing it, we're losing it. Love isn't static. Love, you can't bank it. Love, you can't pile it. Love, you can't hoard it. It's a transient thing, and you have to keep passing it on, or you'll never have it for yourself. Yeah, they saw a vision, they heard a voice, and the voice that they heard speaks to us this day. He is my son whom I love. Listen. Listen. Amen. This is a new one for you, the Lord of the Dance. 261. Would you stand with me? I know you will. Will you dance with me?